Good morning and welcome again to the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting System and the Canadian scene. We're together again with my colleague Ronald Dart, professor from the University of the Fraser Valley. And we'll be talking today about a great Canadian author, Mazo de la Roche, and her legacy. Ron Dart is one of the primary experts on our red Tory tradition in Canada and on many of the great authors from the past who have really been red Tories, not necessarily affiliated politically, but nevertheless their writings reveal that kind of a mentality. And Mazo de la Roche was one of the more famous Canadian writers in the early 1920s and into the 30s especially. Some of her books have been made into series on telly, and the White Oaks of Jalna is probably her most famous work. And right into the 60s it was on the television. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about Mazo de la Roche with Ron Dart and try to tease out some of the legacy that she left to us and her important role in Canadian letters and in Canadian history as well, and try to perhaps restore her memory a little. Ron, you're broadcasting about Mazo de la Roche, and there is a Mazo de la Roche Society, I understand.
Yes, they've done a great deal to uphold, to keep in the forefront the significance of Mazo de la Roche, not only the 16 novels of the Jalna series, which is probably the most productive output that any writer has had in Canada in terms of the sustained series. Robertson Davies considers the Jalna novels probably the apex of any writer who's held together that many novels, the story of the, well, in this case, the White Oaks family, the generations of them, the internal dynamics of the family. And so the Mazo Society is the only society in Canada right now that is continuing to keep the significant works of Mazo de la Roche. She, in her time, over 11 million copies of her books were published in 93 languages. So she's obviously a significant literary presence, not only in Canada, but a forgotten one, yeah, but also in the United States and in England also, and beyond that.
What fascinates me about Mazo de la Roche is how she could hold her characters together for that many novels through so many developments, because that in itself is a phenomenal talent. I mean, it requires a phenomenal mind to do that.
Oh, it's a work of genius in which she could hold together these complex characters within an unfolding plot of a family, the White Oaks family, which in many ways that some people want to sometimes, I may just interject here a little bit. One of our great Tory historians, Donald Creighton, talks about the liberal authorized reading of history. And in that authorized reading of history, often anyone who doesn't fit within that broader liberal agenda is dismissed from the literary, political canon of literature. And Mazo de la Roche has faced that fate in many ways. And so the attempt to recover her and put her back in the canon of Canadian literature, when you think of, as I was mentioning earlier, the number of books she sold, and then all the languages that's been translated, that's significant enough for her to be placed in any reading curriculum of Canadian literature. But often she gets dismissed as, well, she's this dated, British Tory tradition whose face turned towards England and had to deal with the emerging Canadian context in which the slowly declining British influence was vanishing and the increasing presence of the American reality was there. And that's certainly one overarching element in Mazo de la Roche's Jalna novels. But as you say, what underlies a lot of her works cannot be easily dismissed by she was a part of a disappearing, a dated British presence. But each of her characters are in fact archetypes of tendencies in the human condition. So whether we talk about the very entrepreneur, utilitarian, Rennie or Piers who stays with the soil and they're not concerned with the arts or culture, they just want to know, what is being produced, what's the profit, what comes, and then the very artistic side of the family, whether it's Eden or whether it's Finch, is that these are types of the human condition. And so once you begin to scratch below the surface of on the one hand, the British, Canadian, American issues, the loyalist, what's the Canadian attitude towards the Americans, towards the British, you're dealing with characters that have perennial significance. It's what Matthew Arnold talked about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales as God's plenty. Well, in many ways, the White Oaks family are God's plenty, and each of them have a perennial significance, and you can find them in the human condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that seems to be in some of the reviews of De La Roche's work is missed too often by some, is the exploration of what's actually going on inside in the human psyche, in the human mind, and how it manifests itself outwardly, and how it impacts on other people around them. And it seems to me that the White Oaks does a marvelous job of that.
Oh, that's superb.
Great job.
So she's very, in that sense, very Tolstoyan in terms of how Tolstoy can, you can have characters in his novels who in the external world things are happening, but there's a whole universe or cosmos going on in their internal life.
Yep.
And in Mazo de la Roche's novels, chapter after chapter, you have the various characters in the novels. They're involved either in dinners or they're at churches or they're chatting with someone. Meanwhile, in their internal life, there's a whole other world going on, and so it's a stream of consciousness tradition. So in Mazo de la Roche's writings, you have someone who holds together in a very exquisite and evocative way both the complex nature of the inner landscape of what it means to be human, and also the complex nature of the external world we live, move, and have our being in. So definitely, and in that sense, she's, drawing from the Tolstoyan, the stream of consciousness, the Virginia Woolf tradition, and it's all at work in her, or the genius of her literary mind.
Yeah, well, genius is a good word. I thought that reading her works and trying to look at them, and in a way comparing with Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was also exploring inner human psychologies and how people sometimes cover up for them on the outside. And of course, some of her characters in White Oak didn't do much covering up, but it was the thing is that we had a real genius of an author like that, enormously productive. And when you look at the era in which millions of her books sold originally, it's even more remarkable at that time that to have sold that many books. So she really captured something very deep within human thought and within human psyche itself, because people responded to what she was writing. And would hold on to, it's one of those books that you get and you're waiting for the next one because you've got to see what happens next, because these are real people doing real things. And almost not fictitious characters anymore.
And I think your reference to Shakespeare is excellent in that, well, first of all, one of the characters in the novel, the Uncle Ernest, he's doing an annotated work on Shakespeare, but more importantly than what Nicholas is doing, Shakespeare in his tragedies, his comedies, his tragicomedies, you always have a combination of the substantive, the big issues with the fool, the mad person, the clown, and so in Mazo de la Roche, you've got on the one hand, some people just read it for almost the Harlequin romance, all the flaming, relationships, the affairs, and the titillating nature of that. But that's just an entry-level point into Mazo de la Roche. And in one sense, as in Shakespeare's plays, that would hold the sort of person who just want that sort of level of literature. But also you go further into Shakespeare, and obviously you're dealing with the big historical, the big political, the character dramatizations and sketching. And so in Mazo de la Roche, you have the initial sort of bait that can draw people on and want to be titillated, just as in Shakespeare, but then she'll take you more and more into the big issues of arts and culture and personality conflicts and dynamics between people and drama, because she did a couple of plays actually, even before the first Jalna in 1927 came out. They were dealt it within the Hart House, University of Toronto. And so she has that dramatic flair within her that works itself out in the Jalna novels. Most only know her for the Jalna novels, but she also wrote in many other genres, tendencies, and being in British Columbia, one of her cousins who grew up in Newmark with her was H.R. Macmillan from Macmillan Bloedel. She actually did a biography of Macmillan.
I didn't realize they were related.
Yes, yeah, they both grew up in the Newmarket area. And so by 1938 she'd had a biography of Macmillan, A Journey of a Man, and it's the story of her cousin's life, H.R. Macmillan, who started Macmillan Logging and then Macmillan Bloedel, and of course Weyerhaeuser took that over.
Yeah, Macmillan Bloedel and Powell River.
Yes.
It used to be. She had, was she not a neighbor of Dorothy Livesey?
Yes, from 1924 to 1928, just before Jalna became successful in 1927. She lived in Trail Cottage with Carolyn Clement, and it's those 4 years were very significant years for her because she had a small reading audience. But Dorothy Livesey's parents lived right in Clarkson, and Trail Cottage was just quite close to the Livesey home. So the young Dorothy Livesey, who was an inspiring poet, literary person, who grew up in a literary family, both her mother and father, well, her father was very involved in journalism at the highest levels in Canada. Dorothy was constantly observing Mazo de la Roche, Carolyn Clement, and in her later years, when people were attacking Mazo de la Roche, Dorothy Livesey has written 3 very fine articles in which she comes to the defense of Mazo de la Roche. So interesting, in Canada, you have someone who's seen as a dated, historic, Tory writer who, as I mentioned, amongst sort of the authorized version, why would we care about them other than artifacts of history? And then we have more of a left-of-center Canadian poet. You see her defending this Tory writer. So in Canada you have this interesting blend of Toryism and radicalism come together, and particularly the interaction between, on the one hand, the young Dorothy Livesey and Mazo de la Roche, and then when Mazo de la Roche dies, Dorothy Livesey comes to defend her.
Maybe the Liveseys had something of a salon in their house, didn't they, with a lot of writers and people coming and going.
Yeah, that Clarkson, I have family who live in the Clarkson area, actually fairly close to where the Trail Cottage was, and then where the Livesey home was. And also in that area is the Benares homestead, which some will argue was the home, the setting from which the Jalna novels themselves were patterned. And she mentions the church. You just head up the street a little bit of St. Peter's Anglican Parish. And many have argued that, in fact, if you want to understand the actual empirical setting of Jalna, there's the Benares residence, there's St. Peter's Parish, there's the Lake Ontario just a little south, and there's debates about what was the actual building she used, or family, or setting, but there's a little debate. Heather Kirk has done some interesting books, very insightful on this. But yeah, so Clarkson is a very important area, particularly Trail Cottage from 1924 to 1928, but when Jalna was launched, she won this huge award in 1927, and really that was the beginning of the 16 Jalna novels, which no Canadian, actually, there's very few novelists anywhere, have matched that level of consistency over that period of time in unpacking, unraveling, probing, picking ever deeper into the White Oaks family, which, as I mentioned, are not just a family of sort of English-Canadian stock interacting with the Americans, but they're a microcosm of the human family.
Yeah. And a microcosm of Canada at the time, maybe because Benares and Jalna are both in India. Maybe that's why they put the two together. It's like trying to put the little town together in Sunshine Sketches. You know?
Interesting that you mentioned Sunshine Sketches, because Mazo de la Roche was almost a contemporary of Stephen Leacock, and she's also buried right beside Stephen Leacock at Père St. George's in Sybil Point. So there's Timothy Finley has written a fascinating article arguing there's some sort of relationship between Leacock and Mazo de la Roche. It's quite a comical, Timothy Finley running off in all directions. But sure,
Well, Leacock would appreciate that.
Yes. Well, he would see the humor in it all, of course he would.
You know, I'm wondering what is transpiring now in trying to bring Roche back into I'd say the curriculum, because to me it's so important, because I can't think of another writer in the last century or two who's had the genius to hold a picture and a development of something together the way she does in Jalna, and to hold the characterizations together. I mean, to me that is absolutely phenomenal.
Well, it's just outstanding. It's in terms of a writer, yes, you're right, over, from 1927 till, her death in 61, she's gradually unraveling, unpacking the dynamics of this family, the complex nature of personalities and interactions. And there is no writer in Canada, I would argue, in the United States or England, who has the level of her sophisticated ability, novel after novel, to hold audiences at both the superficial level and a substantive level, but tell an epic tale of not only a family, but the significance of that family in terms of the human condition. And so when we omit her, or we marginalize her, or ignore her, or censor her out of the Canadian canon, we in fact pass on to students and our culture a distorted understanding of the richness and the fullness and the motherlode of Canadian literature itself.
Yeah, but Carolyn and Mazo de la Roche had an interesting relationship, and I wonder if they didn't create a kind of a fantasy world together that helped propel some of Mazo's writings.
Well, there's loads of speculation on the nature of the relationship of Mazo de la Roche and Carolyn Clement, and of course at their gravestones you've got hand in hand we kept the faith. Mm-hmm. And there's much speculation about the nature of their relationship, and there's often projections of sort of a postmodern approach to what was going on there. Was it a Boston marriage, some would argue? Was it just a normal female relationship at that time that many females, for that matter, had, that were close, that were intimate, they were dear friends, and nothing more. So you have different people interpreting, projecting on that. But there can be no doubt that Carolyn Clement played a significant, indeed an instrumental role in Mazo de la Roche's writings. When Mazo de la Roche was going through depressions, when she was paralyzed in terms of writing, it was Carolyn Clement who was there often to write down, add someone. Whiteoats of Jalna, I mean, Mazo would be writing and Carolyn would be filling in other parts, so it was sometimes Mazo de la Roche is given all the credit, but it was the two of them were one in many ways in terms of their literary vision, being able to complement one another. When one faltered, the other would hold them up, and so they were two, as Aristotle would say, two bodies, one soul.
Yeah, well, it's odd how we always have to sexualize a lot of the things. Of course, it has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with someone's talent anyway. But the fact is that a close collaboration like that was something that was probably more frequent in the early part of the last century, in the 1800s, where there was a symbiotic relationship of some kind, and it forms a very profound bond. But certainly Carolyn Clement doesn't get credit.
No,
as much as she should either.
Yeah. And they were in many ways what the Celtic tradition would call soul friends, they were one. But I think your point is well taken. There's a film has recently come out, actually very good and insightful film called The Mystery of Mazo de la Roche. Came out in 2012, but it tends to, C.S. Lewis in a debate once with Tilliard, both in England at the time, they had a debate about what is more important in a writer, their personal life or what they produce, the fruit on their tree. And Tilliard argued that if you ever hope to understand a writer, you have to dig a little bit into their personal life. Lewis argued, he called that the personal heresy. And he said to be excessively fixated on a writer's personal life is somehow the only way of explaining the literary genius or the works they produce, poetry, prose, drama. It can lead you astray, and sometimes there can be an excessive fixation on an artist's personal life, which then, I mean, what brings an artist to the fore, to the front stage in our lives is what they're producing.
Yep.
And then people often move away from what they're producing to their private lives. But what drew people was what their, the works of drama, literature, poetry, prose, you name it. And so it's I mean, there is a place, but it can get tedious at times, and constantly digging about in the maze of someone's inner life or trying to unpack their life in that way. And then you begin to move away from the actual works they produced, which is what drew us to them in the first place.
Yeah, that's, I think even Shakespeare's gone through a bit of that. But it's tragic because you never know what's going on inside the person, no matter what their external personal life was. And people are always looking for things to be autobiographical in a way. And undoubtedly they sometimes are. The way Mazo started out her life and the way she brought herself to where she was. That was an enormous struggle, of course.
There is a mystery there because she does begin in, a difficult family context. Her mother's always ill. Her father dies young, as does her mother. Her real name is Mazy Roche. I mean, Mazo de la Roche gives you sort of an inflated, high mucky-muck sort of a name, as if you come from a distinguished heritage and family. And so there is this interesting morphing going on. And people argue, even in her autobiography, Rigging the Changes, is, she left as much out as she included. And so there is this fascination with her life with Carolyn Clement. I might also just add, in an age of ecology and environmental awareness, Mazo de la Roche has the exquisite ability to describe nature and the relationship of humans and nature in a way that cannot but just hold your attention and hold it in a rapt and attentive manner. Some of the descriptions in the Jalna novels, and her many other works for that matter, they just hold you spellbound in terms of her ability as a wordsmith to describe a scene. And also her works on animals, her little book on Bunty the dog, and her other animal books. I mean, in an age of animal rights, here's someone who's way ahead of their time in terms of understanding an affinity with nature, obviously an affinity with the animal world. And so underneath Mazo de la Roche's soul was this sympathetic ability to feel with the other and to understand the other, whether it was nature, whether it was Carolyn Clement, whether it was the complex novels in the Jalna series, whether it's animals. She had this very unusual sensitivity in terms of being able to feel the inner essence of the other. It's what in philosophy is called connaturality, in which you can become one with the other without losing who you are, but in fact be able to describe the other.
I call it profound empathy because sometimes her descriptions of nature are almost like love letters to nature itself, or to the scene. And it makes, to me, she's an extremely attractive person. But, it's one difficult thing is that a person who's that creative can never be analyzed in any normal way. No. I mean, you can't apply norms to analyze a person like that. They're the complexities of the person themselves. I'm sure that de la Roche was as necessary to her as anything else in her life. And it gave her something that was part of her creativity. That's one of the things that we critics sometimes miss, because critics are trying to criticize sometimes. The complexities of anybody who's creative or produces a great deal. They're bound to be, from the world's point of view, eccentric.
And they'll be caricatured, and yes. And Earl Burney Earl Burney talks about literary critics. He often sees them as literary crickets because they chirp away, but they don't often even understand what's going on. And so you're trying to deal with someone like Mazo de la Roche from a literary critic perspective. They're more like literary crickets.
That's interesting, because Anna Komnina, in her Alexiad, she uses that terms. She calls them the perpetual chirpers. But I'm so happy to see that something's being done with Mazo de la Roche in this. What other works of hers strike you?
Well, I think she covers a variety. Obviously, there's the literary Mazo de la Roche, the Jalna books, the the dramas she actually has done too that were put on stage. Many of her books were put on, well, like in 1972. I remember very clearly to this day, I was about to go to Europe in 1972. CBC had put on the White Oaks of Jalna.
Oh.
But she did hit books of history, sort of Quebec, the seaport of Quebec, so she was a historian. She wrote drama, she did novels. She's in that sense a Renaissance lady, or a humanist woman of the, you know, the best heritage and line and lineage that you can think of. So, and her vocation was obviously to write, even to the end when she was in her last days and she could hardly move her fingers. She would have them on the quill, wanting to get to the next line out of, and so it was a woman vocationally called to write.
Yeah. What about her plays? She did a few plays, didn't she?
Yes, a variety of plays that some had gone, as I mentioned earlier, to the stage at Hart House, and before Jalna came out, and there were other plays that came after. And you'll notice that a lot of the Jalna novels have that theatrical, that dramatic flair, that dramatic touch to them. So in her you get this blend of the dramatist, Shakespeare, and the novelist, and the prose writer, and the poet, and so she's not easy to net in terms of the genre that she works out of. She's a very complex writer, and her plots are thick, her characters are complex. But she also, as I mentioned earlier, there's almost the Harlequin romance side to her, which a lot of, and it's interesting, the Pan edition of the books, you have all these pictures of these, you know, flaming women with hair going in one direction. It's almost the sort of the Bronte, the tradition, and the Jane Austen, and so that sort of, for those who are often drawn to the Austen Bronte tradition, she seemed to play into that. But just as in Bronte and Austen, there's far more to them than that in terms of personality analysis and plot. So in Mazo de la Roche, there's far more.
Yeah, once in a while, when I watched The Great Gatsby, and I thought, it reminded me of bits of Jalna, in a way, you know, some of that. But, you know, the other, that's what makes me wonder if maybe part of the relationship with she and Carolyn wasn't kind of, not a fantasy world, but some kind of, I mean, I think part of the relationship was the ability to take themselves into another sphere of some kind and sort of live it out instead of just acting it out. And they must have had some kind of the whole world going on there that was rather theatrical, internally theatrical.
Oh, I think there's a very, and you get that in a lot of the Jalna novels, very, very much an aesthetic dimension, almost pre-Raphaelites, where you're almost outside the world of time in history, in a totally, you know, another dimension, or running alongside of time in history, and particularly Finch, who Mazo de la Roche identifies with, who's probably the literary artistic creme de menthe person in the book. You get this, you know, is the material world really real, or what's real, and creating a whole other world with Finch, its music, or its drama himself, acting, and so it's a world beside the world we live in. And I think not only in terms of her writing, but in terms of the lifestyle with Carolyn, sure, they're living in a very aesthetic, as I was mentioning, there is that tendency to slip into almost a pre-Raphaelite, hyper-aesthetic existence.
Yeah, disconnected, almost like looking down on the scenes in a way. But she adopted 2 children, did she?
Yes.
Yeah.
Early 1930s. They were in Europe at the time. And Renee and Esme, actually Esme is interviewed in the film Mystery of Mazo de la Roche. Renee died earlier. And so that is also an interesting study of, you know, of them, Carolyn Clement, Mazo de la Roche raising the 2 children, nature of that, and the impact of that on Mazo de la Roche's writing. And so, yes, so there's the two children.
Yeah. That's interesting in itself. She was way ahead of her time in that respect. But how would you frame her impact within a Red Tory context? I mean, she was a Red Tory. I mean,
she was, yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, the background of her writings is constantly that English tradition, and of course Jalna the family comes from, as British, they had been in India for a time, and then they came to Canada. But I think some of the themes, as I mentioned earlier, that give them an affinity with Toryism. One, the great affinity to the natural world,
Yeah.
the ability to describe poignantly and clearly the relationship between one sense, economics and ecology, because they're having to run their estate, Jalna. They're, the horses, the apples, they've got to keep the family afloat financially, but they're also doing it in a relationship to a natural world.
Yeah.
And so there's this, and any Tory is very interested in what's the relationship between economics and the environment. I would say any Tory is always interested in the relationship between the inner and the outer life.
Yeah.
To be human is to recognize we live in two spheres, an immense interior landscape and an external world we live in, and so you can't separate sort of politics from psychology. These things very, very much go together.
The difficulty with talking about it is people see, now we call them neocons Tories, and they're not, of course, but Stephen Leacock could be quite radical, although he was a Tory. She's in that somewhere in that same framework.
As you were mentioning The Great Gatsby, I mean, Fitzgerald was very much inspired. Next year will be the anniversary of Arcadian Adventures, The Idle Rich, came out in 1914, and Fitzgerald was so inspired by Leacock's Arcadian Adventures, The Great Gatsby comes from that.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, so I think, and then I think her ability to draw personality types. A Tory is always very careful about reducing people to simple categories, as if people are not complex, interior and exterior. And what she has the ability to do at her best is to sketch in fully developed personalities. That way you can't easily judge someone who's a complex personality. And so now there's a form of conservatism, of course, that is ideological and wants to reduce things to black and white categories and left and right and center and this sort of stuff. Once you're getting into the complex nature of economics and ecology as lived out by the White Oaks, the inner, the outer life, complex nature of personalities, these sorts of things, you're into a much more subtle and nuanced understanding of conservatism, because you're conserving something much more complex that in many ways Mazo de la Roche embodied in the Jalna novels, her dramas, her short stories, her animal stories, all these things. And I think in many ways she's way ahead of her time in terms of ecological issues, animal rights issues, and not have but a way of seeing, which you would call with a sympathetic affinity or empathy.
Powerful empathy in my view.
Yes.
It was.
Yeah. So I think those are some elements that if people just want to reduce Toryism to a simple political ideology, they do not understand Toryism.
No, well, that's part of the neocon problem, in a way. And so many of our great writers were completely the opposite, and yet real conservatives, real Tories, in that way. But Mazo de la Roche always fits into that whole picture of the literary red Tory in it. So what would you like to add to this about Mazo de la Roche?
Well, I think, as I was mentioning earlier, I think one of the tragic things that has occurred with the authorized reading of Canadian history is this omitting, this caricaturing, this distorting of a literary, cultural, artistic tradition in Canada which does not fit the authorized reading. So when most people, you mention Canadian literature, most people would say, oh, Margaret Atwood, Canada, oh, everybody knows that because she's been put forward as an icon of that authorized reading. And there's a whole range of people in Canadian literature, both past and present, that are studied. But to omit a genius like Mazo de la Roche says a lot about the prejudices of the literary Sanhedrin of our time. And I think in dialogues like this, if we can begin to recover and reclaim this tradition, people will then have a much more sophisticated and nuanced view of what Toryism is, literary Toryism, of which Stephen Leacock is almost a contemporary with her, and of course she's a contemporary in many ways of Anne of Green Gables, Lucy Maud Montgomery, that tradition as well. And so there's a heritage here which consciously puts some people forward and consciously exorcises others because they don't fit the canon, the tradition. And something like this in the Mazo Society, we can begin to reclaim. It helps us understand the fullness of the Canadian tradition.
To me, it's sort of the Tisch storm. The UBC is sort of a microcosm of that in a way. To me, because they were trying to reshape everything in terms. Everything became then sort of Americanized, and anything that had a British content or connected with the British was somehow to be downplayed. It's like the movement. There was a movement during that era to change the names of some of our streets, like Trafalgar and others, because they were British wars, and why should we commemorate them? Even to remove the statue of Queen Victoria and other things at this time, every mark of our history. Unfortunately, we did it not just with the monuments to the Edwards. There was a plaque to King Edward on the old wall around the old courthouse, which became the art gallery and vanished completely. King Edward Center, as far as I know, is gone. But to sort of sanitize our history in a rather perverse manner, to pretend a lot of it didn't exist, and at the same time to sort of push out some of the greatest figures in our history, particularly in the literary world, is really, it's a national tragedy.
Well, it's a travesty in that it is these people like Mazo de la Roche, Stephen Leacock, and many others who, many will argue, well, that's part of the imperial colonial era, and we're in a post-colonial era. Therefore, we want nothing to do with them other than artifacts of history. You want to say, what a superficial understanding of these. I mean, what they do is they ennoble us and walk us hand by hand, as it were, to the great themes of the human condition, as a Shakespeare did, as a Tolstoy did.
Yep.
And that's what, when he says she's our Canadian Tolstoy and Shakespeare, when properly read and thoughtfully understood. And so, when you ignore these people, in fact what you're doing is you're shutting yourself off from the big perennial elements of what it means to be human, and we do that, then you get the thinning out of the human soul and condition and our understanding of humanity.
Well, it seems to me that in trying to cut off the British heritage, what we do is become compradors of Americanism instead, because we're replacing it with something. We're not replacing it with something profoundly Canadian, because Canada is an evolutionary process. It's not a revolutionary process. And this whole evolutionary process of ours is part of what makes us Canadian. So to suddenly want to turn that off like a valve and turn on a new spigot and become colonials of a different republic is really not a worthy enterprise. That Mazo de la Roche is not the only one who's been tragically forgotten, but I don't think we have anyone who can hold a candle to de la Roche as a literary genius anywhere.
No, she towers above all the rest of her period of time. In terms of, she had obviously a momentum and a literary power Leacock never had, in terms of being able to draw out something as grand and insightful as the Jalna novels. Leacock could do little sketches, but he could never develop something. He just didn't have that ability. And in one sense, at a children's story level, obviously Lucy Maud Montgomery did with her Anne of Green Gables, but there's nothing at an adult level in Canadian literature comparable to the Jalna series.
No, that's a fact, and I'm so happy that there's a Mazo de la Roche Society and that they're trying to restore this. And we need another movement to restore the great Canadian literature to the curriculum, to really influence our own people, and really to see the evolution of Canada itself in all of this. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, and we send our best to the Mazo de la Roche Society and hope that they'll prosper in all of this. Do you have any closing thing or anything?
No, I think this has been a wonderful primer, at least in introducing people to Mazo de la Roche and the significance of her in terms of a real canon of Canadian literature versus the liberal canon of Canadian literature, and her significance as one of the one of the preeminent literary geniuses of Canadian literature.
And those of you who see this video on any media, I would urge you to explore the works of Mazo de la Roche and really enter into the world that she created and see how it's really formative and how so much of it still echoes down to the Canada in which we live today. And you see the kind of complexities of humanity that she was able to bring out, and perhaps have us do a little bit of rethinking about how we judge other human beings and how we judge society and culture, and see the great complexity and nuances in every individual human being that can never be put into some white and black category. There's no such thing as black and white in the human condition, only shades of gray. And Mazo de la Roche really is a genius at making that clear. And I think she has a lot to offer to us, not just on a purely literary basis, but also on insights to humanity itself and to the human condition, and perhaps open us up and make us ourselves a little more human and a little more humane. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Ron, for giving us this opportunity to discuss Mazo de la Roche and the Canadian tradition.